So we are live now.
You live?
Yeah.
Okay, good evening, everyone. We're actually here at a Google Hangout. We're actually discussing MDGs, Millennium Development Goals, beyond 2015, the fate of MDGs in India. We've all have been hearing about what this country should look like and what the agenda should be in terms of poverty. There are almost 8 MDGs that we have, and there was a target of 2015 that nations were supposed to achieve. We have lagged behind on several fronts. We have several speakers today. Right now, we have Dr. Shashi Tharoor, who's a 2-time member of parliament, has worked with the UN, has authored several books. We have Amitabh Beher, who's actually currently head of National Foundation for India. We have Paul Divakar, who is also the convener of Wada and Todo Abhiyaan. Apart from that, he's an activist, economic rights expert, human rights defender, does lots of things. We have Shireen from Save the Children. She heads advocacy there. And we'll soon be joined by Parvinder Singh, who actually heads campaigns for Oxfam India. To begin this discussion, we want to go straight to Dr. Tharoor because of 2 primary reasons. One, that you work with the United Nations, sir, and the other is that you work with the government as well. So one of the main things that we talk about is, was the promise too far-fetched, and if the government has actually done something? Because when we were talking about executing MDGs, your government was in power. What happened in the last 10 years?
Well, look, I was actually at the UN when this target was adopted, and it was always understood this was going to be a target that governments would agree to do, and governments would take the responsibility for fulfilling in their own countries. That was the entire logic of setting up the MDGs by us at the UN on Kofi Annan's team working on this. When I came into government, which was just 5 years ago, already, in fact, things had been fairly well advanced. We were already 6 years short of the overall target of 2015. And as you know, there are 8 goals, which boil down to 18 targets. So there's quite a bit to talk about in a very short span of time today. I would say the big picture is that on the very first goal of eradicating extreme poverty and hunger, which is tantamount to halving the proportion of people whose income is below the poverty line. The UN said $1 a day. We've tended to go with the All India figures we have. We are well on track. That is, that we have actually managed to do more than half in terms of purely reducing our poverty line. And the last 10 years or so, we managed to pull more than 1% of our population out from below the poverty line each year. And I think the target by 2015 would be to have a poverty headcount ratio of about 20.7%, which is lower than the target of 23.9% that had been accomplished earlier. So there is a good indication of a target that has been fulfilled. The target of universal primary education has also been fulfilled. In fact, we managed to get so many kids into school after the Right to Education Act that the gross enrollment ratio at primary level is now 116%. That is, we've enrolled more kids into school than we thought existed at that age group. So those 2, I think, are the very big successes.
Dr. Tharoor, one of the
I was just finishing. One of the sub-targets on poverty is the hunger target, and there I would say we are not doing very well, not well enough anyway, and that's one of the reasons why the UPA government came up with the Food Security Act and so on to try and make up for it. I would also say that gender equality and empowerment of women is making very slow progress. I think we need to do much, much better there. Though on the literacy rates of women, we've seen some significant improvements, which have seen not only an absolute improvement in women, but also a narrowing of the gap between women and men. So those would be my big headline issues. We can go through all the targets and all the goals, but I don't want to monopolize the time available for this discussion. Those would be my headline points in answer to your question.
A lot that you talked about, Dr. Tharoor, of course, as in it's also what UPA says, what it has achieved in the last 5 years. But coming to access to education, I'm sure I'll get Shireen to comment on what has been the impact on education. But the figure that I actually have is that we claim to have achieved universal primary education with 98.3% enrollment, and that's what you were talking about, right to education. and access to education. But 6.6% of the children leave school in the first grade, and further 10% drop out in the fifth grade. So you might have had Sarva Shiksha Abhiyaan, you might have had right to education, not just for 5 years, for 10 years, 15 years, 20 years. We've been talking about many of these issues, but the fact that we still have such dropouts, it doesn't really serve the purpose. The idea of Millennium Development Goals wasn't just about infrastructure vis-a-vis a school, but about taking a child and making sure there's an environment of education. Why have we failed there, sir?
Well, I would say that that we have, in fact, tried to attend to precisely those issues, which is why the UPA government attached a lot of importance to every school having clean drinking water available, having a usable toilet, particularly a girls' toilet, because we know that after a certain age, girls do need to change during the day, and if they can't change at school, they'll go home and they may not come back. So we have tried to address these issues to ensure precisely that we eliminate or reduce the possibility of dropouts. There are still, unfortunately, social realities in our country. Poverty is a major factor. And sometimes the pressure of poor families to keep children at home to be of help to the parents, it tends to outstrip what the state wants to accomplish. Now, right now, as you know, one major change in the RTE Act is that in the old days, if a child wasn't in school, it was the parents who were responsible. Today, if a child isn't in school, the state is responsible. It is something that's a legally enforceable right to actually have education. And so we can push it. If you're talking about a 10% dropout rate by class 5, that is actually not that bad, because sadly, by the time you get to class 8, that rises much more. By class 8, enrollment figures drop to 69% from the 116% that we're getting in class 1. So already the dropout rates are increasing. By class 10, it's dropped even further. And certainly the percentage of kids who see themselves all the way through to class 12 is very low. But the MDG goal was actually pitched only at primary education, because the idea was to achieve a basic level of literacy in every society, even if kids didn't see their way all the way through to finishing education. And I think that modest goal we have accomplished.
One thing before I get in other panelists, one criticism for MDG is that it wasn't well analyzed, and you were there when all this was happening, when the planning was taking place. Poverty is not something that has happened to us now. We were aware of these figures. We were aware that there are dropouts, there's lack of infrastructure, there's poverty, there's class dynamics, there's regional dynamics, there are several reasons. Is it so that it was very, very rushed and romantic and unscientific, these targets that were actually created by the UN? Because that's what the analysis of many people who actually have evaluated MDGs talk about.
No, I think it is much more aspirational. In other words, if you remember the famous line of those of you who studied English literature, a man's reach must exceed his grasp, or what's a heaven for. That was the spirit. It was that our reach must exceed our grasp. We must demand more of ourselves than we even believe we can fulfill. When these targets were adopted, many of us thought they could not be accomplished. In fact, none of us expected that any of the goals would be accomplished. The one goal we had some hope for was the one that has failed most spectacularly, which is Goal 8, the Global Partnership for Development. The rich countries went through a recession and never came through with the assistance that they had pledged. And that was the one thing we expected, because these targets were adopted when the world was booming. Global economies were booming, the US had a surplus, Britain was booming under Blair, everything was different. So the one target we expected to see fulfilled has been the most ignominious failure. But everything else has done far better, and often for odd reasons. For example, the poverty figure globally has succeeded because of China and India alone. If you look at eradicating extreme poverty and hunger globally, the 50% target has been accomplished single-handedly almost by China. So you can't just look at a global figure and say it's been a success, because you will see a large number of African countries which have not got to the success levels of China or even India. And therefore, we knew at the time that these goals were being adopted, they were aspirational. We wanted countries to try for them, but we fully recognized that in many cases countries would not be able to accomplish what they hoped to accomplish. The idea was by trying, they would improve the lot of life of the people who were in great need in their countries. And that, I think, that objective has been achieved. Even though MDGs may be an unpronounceable acronym, there's a tremendously sort of increased consciousness, much greater awareness, not just at the elite level, but beyond. And we're already talking about, when the 2015 target comes along, of replacing the MDGs with SDGs, Sustainable Development Goals, to keep the effort going. And I think all of that is worth the effort, even if we're not going to get a 100% mark sheet like a Delhi University cutoff. That was never the expectation realistically, nor can it be.
Sure, sir. So you can see that actually it was MDA rather than MDG. It was Millennium Development Goals.
No, these are goals. They were always goals. Goals are aspirations. In a football match, every minute isn't a goal. You know what you're aiming for. You're trying to get there, but you may end up with a scoreless draw. At least if you're scoring 1 or 2 goals, you haven't done too badly.
Governments aspire, but when we set a goal, perhaps there is a certain amount of accountability, and that people would want to know, why did you set 2015, and was there a science behind it? Anyway, going forward, I wanted to
2015 because 15 years, that's all. We thought that 10 was too short and 20 was too long. We settled on 15. There's no other reason.
Money that was spent, that was actually supposed to be spent on MDGs, it was all spent. Most of the amount was spent on debt, repayment, or on disaster, or on other things. But anyway, we'll come to that. We just quickly want to bring in other stakeholders, other speakers here. Shireen, what's your say? What do you want to talk, as in context of children? Say the children works on several issues, a whole range of issues vis-a-vis MDGs and children. What's your take on how has MDG done? Has it done anything? Can it do more?
Yeah, I mean, I think that it's been varied, the MDGs around children's issues. One of the things that it did do in terms of health, in terms of a focus on infant and under 5 mortality, and of course in terms of education. But these were the 2 ones that kind of focused on children. But of course, issues to do with poverty, wider poverty issues, etc., also impact children. I think the big lesson from the MDGs, I mean, I think as Shashi Tharoor was saying, I don't think we've made that much progress as we ought to have. I mean, yes, we have many more children in school, but nearly 40% actually drop out before the elementary cycle. And what's been a big lesson is that the quality of learning has, if anything, really gone down. I mean, it remains a very, very serious issue. And I think that is something that needs to be addressed going forward in any post-2015 framework. And across the board, there are huge issues of inequities. So whether it is to do with infant mortality or health, or whether it is to do with education, there are huge inequalities between countries and within countries. I think that one of the big lessons from the MDGs is that going forward, really must focus on the fact that it should equally or more equitably benefit different groups of children, whether it's boys and girls or whether it is, other caste groups or ethnic groups or tribal groups that have been disadvantaged, and actually in some ways in the last period have grown further disadvantaged rather than, so the gap has increased rather than closed. So I think any targets that are set going forward should really look at that, whether it's at learning levels, whether it's saving children dying from preventable reasons, and I think the poverty issue, I think that that needs to be really a lot more focused. I don't think I don't think $1 a day or $1.25 is good enough for saying that you've lifted people out of poverty. And I think that one of the kind of critical issues will be going forward about a kind of disaggregation. So I think that the area that we have done quite well in terms of reaching targets, i.e. in India, is around the maternal mortality. I think there we will meet the MDG target. We will probably meet the MDG target for education in terms of access, but that doesn't mean that children in India have been getting a better education. Access to schools has definitely improved, but the fact about what actually education and what children are learning have probably gone down. So I think those are factors that will need to be addressed going forward.
Hello, can you hear me?
I can hear. I think I lost you. Hello?
Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
I think it's the points that you made, one word that stands out, something that is not there in the 8 MDGs, is the word equity. And we haven't really right now in the current context when we look at reasons why development goals have not been met, or there are people who still are off the graph, is reasons of equity and justice. I just wanted to quickly bring in Paul Divakar. Perhaps a lot of your work, sir, is around issues of equity and justice and how that's actually connected to development, millennium, centurion, whatever goals that we are talking about. So Paul Divakar, sir.
Hi, Vimlendu. Thank you for this very important aspect. I think one of the critical challenges of the way forward, without getting into too much of critiquing the MDGs, first of all, MDGs did not have this aspect of inclusion at all. And for most of the southern countries, even the northern nations, if one does not talk about bridging the gaps, as well as looking at the forms of social exclusion which breed inequality and inequities, I think it's extremely difficult to meet any goals, leave alone Millennium Development Goals. And I think now in the Sustainable Development Goals, this is one of the aspects that has been brought in. But the challenge here is, how do you balance growth, environmental sustainability, and looking at the inequalities, bridging inequalities? Especially in the South Asian context, aspects like gender and caste-based discrimination, now we are calling it discrimination based on work and discrimination across work and descent and work. This is a critical aspect that is affecting several countries. Even in Brazil, you look at African countries and definitely Asian countries. And this aspect has not been brought in at all in the MDGs, also in the current post-2015 development paradigm that is being discussed. And if you don't address this issue, I think you will still look at aggregates, you may still get the targets, but you will leave a large quantum of discriminated communities, and there are millions and crores, and they are left behind in this whole game. Hello? Can you hear me?
Paul, we can hear you.
Hello, yes. Amitabh, I want to bring you into the debate. Amitabh, are you there? Can you hear us?
Yes, yeah.
So, Amitabh, a lot of work that you've done earlier, Wada and Todo, and your engagement with Millennium Development Goals. What do you think? Who is responsible? Do we look at a role for civil society organizations? What Paul said, what Shireen said, what Dr. Tharoor said. How do we look at what civil society could do to really achieve what we set out to achieve in 2015 or post 2015?
Amitabh, we can't hear you.
You've lost Amitabh. Maybe Parvinder can take that question right now. Parvinder, do you want to tell us something about what's the role that civil society plays in all this?
I just wanted to quickly respond to two things apart from your question. The first important thing which we really must use time here right now to discuss as well is that will more of MDG kind of work allow us to reach to the final pockets of exclusion? There has been tremendous gains, but the question we need to ask is that, you know, the MDG achievements need to be analyzed in terms of where the future lies. And our understanding is that a lot more has to be done in terms of how we engage with inequality, not just from economic point of view, but also from the point of view which Paul was trying to point out, social exclusion lens as well. Within Oxfam, there has been a lot of discussion where we're demanding for a stronger work in next 500 days toward getting civil society voice heard, and which is largely around the issue of inequality, climate change, gender, and public finance in particular. And we strongly believe that the next phase really needs to focus on power shift and public financing and access to public services is very critical. The gains that have been made also need to be seen in the context of the countries which have made these gains, the public policies that played an important role in making these gains possible, the stability, the vibrant democracy. But moving on from now, it would require a much more radical step towards shifting how our policy and financing happens. To your question on the role of civil society, there's no doubt that MDGs remained a very strong reference point both for policy discussion and also how we worked globally. What we need to do more as civil society is that there is a global aspiration on certain targets, and we are all having that conversation. But there are national targets, and I'm glad Mr. Tharoor kind of brought those aspects very strongly, that the civil society needs to put national influencing on the top of the agenda. Without that, you cannot meet the global targets for sure. And the role civil society also needs to do is to get the nuances and kind of iteration of the specifics of each of these issues. Shireen brought up the points about certain specific MDG goals that need to move beyond it. We can't be really happy about it. But the larger set of MDGs itself, certain aspects need to be relooked at as in terms of what civil society voices can do by defining it further.
Sure.
So that's where I am now. Yeah.
Sure. Amitabh, if you can hear us now, we lost you for a bit. Are you there now? Can you hear us?
Yes. Can you hear
So
me?
we wanted to, Amitabh, I wanted to quickly ask you also, as in your question was answered by Parvinder in terms of a broad role that perhaps civil society organizations can play. When we look at these MDGs, do we need to, it's been 15 years since we made these goals. The goals perhaps would have changed, the society has changed. Do we need some bit of tweaking here in terms of, do we need to include, as we said, equity and justice, are things that needs to be perhaps included? Anything else that perhaps need to change in terms of either creation of goal or the way we're looking at achieving these goals?
Sure. Thanks, Vimlendu. And just let me go back to your question earlier. And I like the acronym that you had, MDA. I would actually say that whether you're looking at aspiration or not, these were really minimum development goals. And these are certainly not aspirational. As in, I would be very surprised if we say that if you're just talking about bringing half of the population out of poverty, that's aspirational. I think that should be totally unacceptable. I think it's unethical. We cannot make the moral choice of who goes hungry, and we let the other half sleep hungry. So I think that there are fundamental shifts needed. And the question that you had asked me earlier, I think civil society certainly has a critical role to play. And let me just say a couple of things in terms of what needs to be done while we move ahead. Again, I would say that the Secretary General, when he gave his report and when he talks of the three fundamental pillars for SDGs, where he looks at the economic dimension, the social dimension, and the environmental dimension, he misses out the most critical one, which is the political dimension. Without really looking at the political questions, it's very unlikely that you would be able to achieve any of the goals that we have. Having said that, let me just say that what we need to change. First, I think the overarching frame needs to change dramatically. At this moment, we are still looking at a poverty frame, and we need to change that frame from a poverty frame to a justice frame. I think it's completely unacceptable in these times that we are still looking at extreme poverty. $1.25 is extremely low, and there's enough research which tells us about multidimensionality of poverty. We need to probably look at the frame of justice. The few other things that I think which thankfully, at least in the current conversations on SDGs are present, though I'm not sure if they'll really go through eventually. I hope Government of India takes a proactive position and pushes these positions. And I'll talk of a few of those in just telegraphic points. The first I would say is the question of human rights. The entire MDGs need to be rooted in human rights. Second is the question of social inclusion, and Paul has already talked about the problem of aggregates. The third is question of gender justice, and gender justice not just in the public sphere but also in the private sphere. The fourth is then the question of environmental justice, and on that I think civil society is reasonably close to the Government of India position. The fifth is the principle of governance accountability, and here again I feel that the Government of India is kind of evading the question and says that this is a domestic question. I think if you don't bring in the question of governance accountability, with the leakages that we have, tax evasion, corruption, I think we'll not be able to achieve the MDGs that we're talking of. And then finally, the question of peace and security. So without creating peace it's unlikely that we would be able to achieve any of the other goals. So let's make a transformative shift. That's the phrase which the Secretary General talks of, the high-level panel talks of, the open working group talks of, but I don't see the fundamentals of transformation that are needed actually getting inked into the new vision.
Thank you,
These
Amitabh.
are all be very sensible points. I'm just wondering, I really have to leave now, as previously mentioned. Is there one more question that you'd like me to address before I go?
Yes, one last question I wanted to ask you is something about this current government, MDG, populism versus development. A lot of times when we look at these making of schools or infrastructure or healthcare, many times the work that government does, its intent is populism rather than actual development. If you could talk about talk something about populism versus development, please.
Well, I mean, to be honest, my own government was accused of this in the sense that some of the schemes that we went in for example, the Mahatma Gandhi National Rural Employment Guarantee Scheme was derided as populism by certain critics, certain economists, whereas I would argue that we've transformed literally lakhs of lives through the scheme. I've met women, for example, in my state, and in Kerala, 92% of the beneficiaries of NREGA are women, telling me anecdote after anecdote about how this scheme has enabled them to really transform their lives. One woman, for example, had a mentally handicapped daughter, mentally challenged daughter, and she was on the verge of giving this child up for adoption at an orphanage when NREGA came in, and she says, now I can hold my head up with dignity and I can afford to keep my child at home. These are the kinds of sort of human transformations that lie behind the figures, the mere percentages and numbers we talk about when we think of MDGs. So I'm not a big critic of that kind of so-called populism. Obviously, there is a macroeconomic argument we made against subsidies and so on. But as a general proposition, I think that a lot of what we've been doing in a country of such great poverty and scarcity has helped improve the lives of people who are at the bottom of the socio-economic ladder. Now, this government you asked about, well, they should speak for themselves, but the impression I have from their 100 days of pronouncements has very much been of a government whose focus is more on infrastructure and on major investments in infrastructure rather than on what you would describe as populism or as reaching out to people. Now, we'll have to see. I think if it goes on the way in which their rhetoric has done from the election campaign onwards, it would be a very different economic approach from that of the UPA. The UPA did indeed go in for many more entitlements, right to education, right to information, right to work, right to security of food, right to livelihood, right to fair compensation for land, etc. And this has been collectively described as populism, welfareism, and so on. The BJP, though it voted along with us on many of these things, has been more critical, and certainly in the election campaign, Mr. Modi and those speaking with him were very negative about going along this route. And they said our people want jobs, not handouts. They want opportunities, not welfare. And so they have, in effect, pledged politically to move away from what you might call populism. But shoving money into infrastructure is one thing. Ultimately, the future of the nation lies not only in building up our storehouse or infrastructure, which is important, but also in improving our human capital, the people in whose name we speak of development. I've always argued that whether we grow at 6% or 9%, what really matters is the 25% at the bottom of our society, because they are the ones about whom all development narratives have to be about. And I think that there, whether you call it populism, whether you call it something else, to my mind, there the real challenge is reaching out to ordinary people. And to use a 21st century metaphor, we need both the hardware of development, on which the BJP government seems much more focused, the roads, the infrastructure, the ports, and so on. And we also need, in addition to that hardware of development, the software of development, which is what the UPA government was more focused on, which is education, healthcare improvements, gender empowerment for women, opportunities for children, and so on and so forth, where I would agree we didn't fulfill all the goals we set out to, but at least we had those goals, we aspired to fulfill them, we pushed in that direction, and we got accused of populism. But we were trying to actually improve the stock of human capital, without which development means nothing. So that would be my response to your question. I'm sorry I have to leave the rest of you, but you have an outstanding panel of highly qualified people who I'm sure will continue the conversation, and I'd love to hear how it all turns out in the end.
Thank you, sir. Thank you for joining us on this debate. We can continue our conversation. I just wanted to take a question to Shireen. Actually, Shireen, it's not to do with children, but you, unfortunately, you're the only female on this panel. And therefore, I thought I'll ask you this question about gender. You know, there's this entire thing about gender empowerment being one of the major focus of MDGs. But if you look at Indian women's representation in Parliament, it has only increased by 1% in 12 years, and it has now become 10.95%. How do you think, you know, social norms would change when we talk about representation, when we talk about gender equality and equity? Mindsets will have to change before we actually see these visible changes all around us.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know whether your question is related to within the MDG targets around gender, or how are we in India going to make a difference in terms of creating more gender equality? Is that what?
All, because if you see MDG 3 was to promote gender equality and empower women. And that empowerment is not just about finding jobs at the lowest level, but also finding jobs at the top level in the parliament.
Yeah,
and if you're not doing it there, how can we actually think of aspiring to really find jobs at the grassroots level? So that was my question.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think that it needs to, you know, I think there needs to be a standalone goal, as has been recommended in the post-2015 framework on gender equality, that cuts across all of these, you know, various targets and goals, whether it's jobs or whether it's education or whether it's health, you know, and I think, but at a bigger level, you know, that you can definitely, I think it should be in every single goal and as a standalone goal that will monitor it right through. But I think for our own context, I think it relies a lot on the kind of, you know, social norms that continue to exist. And I think that needs to be tackled, you know, in different ways. I mean, legislation is one of them. But you know, that will not serve all the answers. That's not going to create. So I think that you can certainly have more representation, etc. And I think education is finally extremely critical. I think that if you have education up to not just the primary education, that won't be good enough, but a full round of secondary education, then I think in the end that will create greater equality in the next generation. But just, you know, I mean, I think it shouldn't also just lie, you know, I think gender needs to be kind of mainstreamed right through. And I think critical issue for us, you know, in the whole region and definitely in the countries around violence, you know, and I think violence has not been addressed adequately enough. In the MDGs, it was hardly addressed at all. And I think we need to look at violence against women and violence against children, for that matter, in all forms, that, you know, again, contributes a large extent.
Yeah. Paul, I wanted to bring you in. The same statistics would also be for vulnerable and marginalized community. That, like we talked about, how there's, you know, unrepresentation or non-representation and therefore misrepresentation. The same thing actually goes in our political process or systems of governance about marginalized communities. How do we bridge that gap?
Just 1 second. Yeah, I think one of the main things here, Vimlendu, is, yeah, can you hear me?
Yes, yes.
Yeah. One of the main things here is we have to shift from aspirational to mandatory goals. This is both globally as well as nationally. As long as we cannot ensure there is an entitlement framework, there's a rights-based approach, especially in the areas of the excluded communities. We are not going to have communities who are able to leverage any of these provisioning. So you can't have it provisioning at the beck and call of the officials and others. So there has to be stronger accountability measures. I think this is one aspect that we'll have to bring in, whether it is, I mean, our country in that sense has moved quite well from, you know, Narega, you've got from employment guarantee scheme to an act you've got a Right to Information Act, you've got Right to Education Act. I think we'll have to proceed in this direction to make sure that the broader governance has to be brought into a rights-based approach, that entitlements can be leveraged, and that's the only way the marginalized communities will be able to make sure, you know, they can use the complaints rather than just be at the beck and call. Now, the second aspect I think which is very, very critical is fiscal aspects, where you know, the way how the budgets are allocated and how they are designed, how they are participated in the way of reviewing and in implementation. I think though we have at the national level fairly transparent measures, when you look at all the subnational levels, you see there are mostly notional, which means they are there proclaimed, but they don't reach the communities. I think this is another area where the clarity in terms of how are we allocating, and is these allocations real, and if these allocations are real, are the communities having access to it in terms of participating in the designing, participation in the executing, and participation also in the way the oversight and audit has been done. I think these are the two critical aspects we'll have to build in if we want and if we ensure that equity aspects are built into any frame that we are going forward.
Sure, sure. You know, in fact, when we look at post-2015, and Amitabh, I wanted you to respond to this, we're talking about, in a way, 2015 to 2019, which is also the new government, the Modi government that we're talking about in many ways. Right now, one of the MDGs that we have is to ensure environmental sustainability. And the way the government is actually looking at growth and infrastructure, we just heard a couple of days ago that the minister actually wanted to revise and relook at green laws. How do we look at that? How do we look at MDGs in this context of new government which wants to create employment, which wants to create infrastructure, but wants to compromise, or at least looks as if it will compromise, it will be at the cost of the environment? Amitabh.
Yeah, thanks, Vimlendu. I think that's really a critical question going ahead. As if you look at the name also, we have now decided globally to now rename this as the Sustainable Development Goals. And when you're talking of sustainability, environment certainly is one of those key pillars. However, I must also say that the emphasis that you have pointed out of the current government is clearly on infrastructure. And we at least internally, domestically, in country, are not having conversations about consumption patterns or the growth trajectory or the developmental models that we are adopting. So I think in the absence of those conversations, it's unlikely that we would really take the environmental concerns very seriously. Let me also add that we've been constantly talking about common but differentiated responsibility when it comes to environmental questions of energy, which I think for a post-colonial society is very critical. And when you look at it from the lens of North and South, I think it's a critical argument, the argument about per capita energy consumption and so on. However, we cannot overlook the entire footprints of India and, for instance, say China. Therefore, we do need fundamental shifts in terms of how we are looking at the energy question, how we are looking at environment. Until unless we start going back in terms of how do we look at our consumption patterns, change that, how are we going to be building our infrastructure, I don't think we'll be able to achieve sustainable development goals.
Sure.
And here I would just want to, remind ourselves, I keep talking about Gandhi, but I do think that it's very, very important to talk about Gandhi's notion where he talks of enough for everybody's need, but not for everybody's greed. We cannot continue with the greed GDP model that we have.
So we're talking actually about individual behavior, we're talking about social behavior, we're also talking about what's the culture that perhaps our government or our corporations of the world actually create for all of us to live in. I just want to quickly bring in Parvinder. Parvinder, going forward, how do we finance these goals? Because that's been another challenge for many of us and many governments. Going forward, post-2015 agenda, who would finance these goals, these modified goals, these sometimes old targets and also new targets?
Thanks, Vimlendu. I think the first question we need to really tackle is the issue of inequality, and then I'll come from that to the question of resourcing, because both of them are linked in a fundamental way. In terms of inequality, I think it's as Amitabh was saying, I mean, it's a very poetic expression, but the reality is that inequality has been growing across the board, across nations, globally as well. And the moment you start looking at it beyond the point of outrage, you also see there is a link. Inequality is fundamentally linked to ability of various groups to have a say or a voice in how resources are kind of devoted and how policy priorities are framed. And I think going forward, one of the important things that needs to be understood is that the global inequality and our national inequality, and Paul would tell you there is a very clear social lens to inequality as well. But if we just restricted ourselves even to economic aspect of it, the resources are getting kind of constricted in few hands. 85 people practically own birds, 1/3 of resources, and then the situation isn't very different in India. So inequality is in a way impacting critically the voice that can influence the public financing and policy allocations are done. To be able to finance our fundamental shift, transformational shift, as was mentioned a while ago, we really need to change the framework as well, where we start looking at inequality as not just an issue which is creating potential social unrest. Because, I mean, look at India, for instance. In next 5 years till 2020, 60% of our population would be in the youth group from 15 to 25. There's a youth bulge. And the level of inequality that is there today is very clearly reflecting on how various comparisons are being made. In terms of specifics of how financing discussion needs to happen, I think it's apart from the prioritization bit where stronger national commitments have to be thought through. Some of the key ones really are that the universal health coverage and the financing as a means of implementation, which means strengthening both the domestic resources as well as mobilization. So, I mean, and tax is a big issue. I think there's been a lot of global discussion, not so much in India, but our taxation system really kind of burdens the poor and spares the rich, and that's pretty much clear. Till we fix this skewed tax system globally, I mean, and at our national levels, we'll always keep getting trapped into these conversations of financing as well. So that's briefly my position, that we need to first accept that inequality leads to people not having voices, so misplaced resource priorities. The second, the current taxation system globally is something that's not really conducive for appropriate distribution to help people step out of poverty. So our NDGs could just be left to discussions if national movements is not made towards these allocations of finances.
Thank you, Parvinder. We just have 5 minutes, so we'll actually be taking a few last comments and questions. But before that, I just wanted to quickly ask Paul. Paul, when we look at these MDGs, I think many of these will be achieved through two approaches. One is confrontational. Sometimes you'll have to fight the system in many ways, because some of these issues that we're talking about has taken a shape of a norm, as in poverty or exploitation or disempowerment or disenchantment has become a norm. So we need to confront that and confront doesn't mean violence, but in terms of aggression, in terms of urgency, and then in many ways also collaborate. So what's the strategy going forward in a country like India, in our democratic setup, in the kind of issues that we're talking about? We're talking about red corridor, we're talking about violence, all of it together. How do we create a system where we demand these MDGs or achieve these MDGs through a mix of confrontation and collaboration?
I think you've well put it, Vimlendu. We have already a very well-bred strategy which is called Sama, Dana, Dandopadaya. We have all these three aspects that need to be, you need to engage, you need to dialogue, you need to confront, and where you need to really, for example, the kind of violence that you see every day, people's hands getting chopped off, heads getting chopped off, hung, naked parading. I mean, you cannot have that kind of a violence just simply saying that, we will try to dialogue with them. So impunity has been a greatest, one of the worst forms of deterrent in all these. So I think we need to engage with the government. We need to ensure that people confront any forces that are divisive, any forces that are violent, and continue to dehumanize and deface them. So we need to have this kind of a combination at every stage, and depend on where the community is situated, at which level. I think we need to use these appropriate measures, but definitely I think we need to take this dialogue as well as protect and promote our rights wherever.
Perfect. I think the last question, and it's for all of us. Why do we need, as in Parvinder also has this interest, why do people need to have, why should there be concern for MDGs? Do we really work around MDGs? Is it important to set these goals or have that vision as civil society organizations, as government, or as society? What's the importance? Amitabh, we can begin from you, and then ask Parvinder and Shireen and Paul.
Sure.
Yeah, so I'll take a quick go at it. I think it's important that since we are on a countdown of 500 days to our original MDG targets, there are two things that need to happen because of which people need to be concerned. One is that this is the time when you give the last mile push to some of the national legislations that are lying and are very important for meeting the targets in general, and also for excluded community and poverty to be reduced. Poverty among excluded communities to be reduced. There is a health bill lying. There is a women reservations bill lying. There is a women farmer bills lying. So I think it's very important that we nationally start putting those things in the forefront. And the second thing is that during this period of time, we also have opportunity to shape what could be the framework and approach and targets definitely for the post-MDG world. And we need to be bold, we need to be transformational, and this is the time when civil society and each one of us really have to get into this discussion so that we can shape the way it is decided and the way it comes out finally.
Amitabh?
Yeah, Vimlendu, I would say, as in, we live in extremely unequal times. We live in times of market fundamentalism, of neoliberalism. I think MDG gives us the anchor to build a strong moral and ethical argument, and that moral and ethical argument gets endorsed not only by individual countries but globally. I think that once you have that anchor, that gives you the strength, particularly your civil society, citizens movement, to rally around this moral and ethical dimension of the political process, and then build, I would say, a very strong challenge to the existing unequal, unjust systems. I think that's where really the big argument for MDGs goes. And then there can obviously several strategic arguments, like what Parvinder said, that these would give us a lot of traction in getting certain bills converted into acts, or even actually changing the outcomes for, say, an Adivasi woman living in Sarguja, in Chhattisgarh. If you're able to adhere to even the MDGs that we have, even in the truncated form that we have, her life conditions would certainly improve. So I see enough both local to global reasons for very passionately and strongly engaging with the MDG debate, and then moving towards popular mobilization to achieve that.
Shireen, in general, your opinion about why should we bother about MDG, and specifically about your work, related to your work?
Yeah, I mean, I think that in general, I think it's been really important to have a kind of universal framework that has both been aspirational as well as has had some clear targets and goals. So I think that has been, I think, really important in terms of the work that Save the Children does, and if that's what you ask, is bringing a focus, a much sharper focus. So for instance, in looking at a reduction of under 5 mortality or children dying below the age of 5, we've seen the sharpest decline in this last MDG period, in this last 15 years, has been the sharpest decline in children dying across, I think, human history. So in that sense, it is a kind of rallying point, and it serves for governments to, help civil society to keep governments on track, to hold them to account, to international commitments made, and perhaps they wouldn't have, whereas children, the children don't have a vote, they don't have a voice, as it were, especially infants or newborns, or the youngest children. So it kind of definitely is hugely helpful. As we've all said, the big issue has been about inequalities, and I think going forward, no target or no goal should be considered met unless it meets all across age, gender, disability, ethnicity. I think it's very important that it's not just India as a whole. If it was Kerala and Tamil Nadu, we'd all be pretty happy, but it has to be that reach the last child, or the last girl, or the last Dalit disabled girl, if you like. So I think that's going to be really important.
Thank you, Shireen. Paul, last words, please.
Vimlendu, there is one worrisome aspect, and I think this we'd have to take it forward. We really don't know where our country is having these consultations. State is representing now. I think most of the decisions on the Sustainable Development Goals on the post 2015 is being taken by small group of bureaucrats. We have interacted with many parliamentarians. Most of the parliamentarians have no clue. Some of the ministers have some idea, but we feel that they are not being consulted. So who is deciding on behalf of a huge country like our nation, India, in taking these consensus forward into the post-2015 paradigm? And this is a concern. I think, of course, it has to be parliamentarians. Of course, bureaucrats need to develop and give a kind of a broad face in terms of what has been so far. But the decisions on what the stand of the country should not be taken by a group of bureaucrats. It should be the representatives, the true representatives of our country, and community voices should be taken into consideration. So this, I feel, is something if Youth Ki Awaaz and networks like you can make sure that the government makes takes into consideration the voices of the community and feeds the parliamentarians and the people's representatives. I think it is very good for our nation, because we want not a few bureaucrats to decide on the direction of our post-2015 paradigm, but definitely many able voices that are there, women, men excluded, and those have to be taken forward.
Thank you, Paul. I think what the point that you raised about democratizing policy making, we don't know, somebody makes it, and it's not just about dissolving commissions like Planning Commission, but also looking at, that's not the only way to really democratize policy making. There needs to be alternate ways, there needs to be bottom-up ways. I think it's been an interesting 1-hour discussion that we've had. We've talked about how equity needs to be brought into the center stage, not just equality. We need to talk about justice. As Amitabh said, that what we're talking about are not really aspirational. These are minimum goals that perhaps to live a life of dignity, we need to have something. These 8 things in our human society. So we're not just talking about Millennium Development Goals, but minimum development goals, and also who is going to drive it? What's going to be the role of civil society, government, be it UPA, NDA, AIADMK, Third Alliance, Fourth Alliance, we don't know. All of us, young people, there's a desire to achieve these goals. How do we achieve these goals? When do we achieve these goals? How do we achieve it in an equitable way? That's the big question that we all need to answer. Thank you all for joining, and thank you all the other people who've been part of this hangout right now through Youth Ki Awaaz. And congratulations, Youth Ki Awaaz, Oxfam, Wada and Todo, for organizing this hangout. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Vimlendu. Very well anchored. And bye, Shireen. Bye, Paul. Bye, Amitabh.
Thank you.
See you soon.
Bye. Well
Offline.
done. Yeah, thank you, Vimlendu. Excellently, you carried it on.